Good morning, folks. Sorry to interrupt these good conversations that are going on, but as those of you that have been in here regularly know, I tend to go over, and I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying to end on time. But on that note, if I do happen to go past our 11:15 end time, please do not feel obligated to stay. If you need to leave, if you have to go get your kids out of class, I will not have my feelings hurt because I've got a great therapist. And so I'll just talk. No, I'm just kidding. I will not have my feelings hurt. I'm trying to make sure I get you out at 11:15, but I have not been super successful at that in most of the classes. But I at least want to make sure that if I do keep you over, I'm still giving you worthwhile material, and it's not just I'm being unnecessarily long-winded. Just because Matthew's gospel is so rich and there's so many things to discuss in it that I just have so much I want to share. And so today, what we're going to be doing, if you look at the slide up here, one of our objectives is that at the end of this class, I wanted you to be able to interpret Matthew's narrative in light of the larger biblical narrative. And the reason that that's one of our class objectives is because this is such a major component to Matthew's presentation of Jesus. Matthew presents Jesus as the fulfillment of the entire Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. It's not just that Jesus fulfills an individual passage here and a passage here. It's everything. Everything in the Old Testament, everything in the Hebrew Scriptures was pointing to this man, according to Matthew, which is quite an amazing claim for Matthew to be making. And that's why in this class, whenever we are looking at a portion of Matthew's gospel or a portion of his text, one of the lenses that we put on is, we go through the big ideas of what that text is presenting, and then we talk about some important details. Then we talk about some literary features, because Matthew is writing a narrative, so it's important to pay attention to that. But then we have a section called Matthew's use of the Old Testament. And it's that section that we're still in today. If you have your class book with you, then go to page 21. Or sorry, page 20. Go to page 20 if you have your class book with you there. I tell you what, I've been forgetting to ask this the last few weeks. Does anybody need a class book? Is there anyone in here who never got one or would like one, who just doesn't have one? Just raise your hand and I'll have... hey, Craig, are you free? Can you grab one for me? Because I forgot to bring them up. If you just go in that back room on the left and just look on your left when you walk in, there's a table and the bin should be right there. And just grab a few and bring them out there. Thank you, Craig. Appreciate it. Craig's my old reliable helper there. Well, I invite you to open your Bibles to Matthew 2. Matthew 2. So we've looked at the big ideas that Matthew is communicating in Matthew 2. We've looked at some important details about this episode in the narrative. But now we're spending our time, just like we did last week, we're spending our time looking at Matthew's use of the Old Testament. Because when you look at Matthew 2, what we call Matthew chapter 2, 4 times Matthew quotes an Old Testament passage and claims that Jesus or the circumstances around Jesus fulfilled this Old Testament passage. And because that's such a major component of Matthew's communication to us, here's what Jesus means. We're going to take the time to stop and look at each of these quotations. And so last week, and again, raise your hand if you need a book. Sorry, I'm interrupting myself. Craig's got a few here. And then Craig, there's one in the very back, just so you know. Thank you, Craig. Last week, we looked at the first quotation in Matthew 2. So if you're looking at Matthew chapter 2, the first quotation is in verse 6. It's actually a composite quotation, meaning that there's more than one Old Testament passage Matthew is quoting there. The bulk of it comes from Micah chapter 5, verse 2, and we looked at that last week. How does Jesus fulfill Micah 5:2? And then the last line of verse 6 is a quotation from 2 Samuel 5:2 about David. And so we looked at what does it mean that Jesus would fulfill this passage about David as a shepherd king? Well, today we're going to look at the next quotation that Matthew gives us and claims that Jesus fulfills. But before we do that, I want to ask you this question. Here it is on the screen. How is Jesus connected to the Exodus? You ever thought about that? What does the Exodus have to do with Jesus? Or to flip it, what does Jesus have to do with the Exodus? And the reason I'm asking you this question is just to prime our thinking, because what we're going to see today is that in Matthew 2, one of the things that he does is he invites us to read the Exodus in light of Jesus. But he also invites us to read Jesus in light of the Exodus. And he does that in two ways that we're going to look at today. One of them is a quotation. He gives us another quotation and says that Jesus fulfills that Old Testament passage about the Exodus. And we're going to look at that one first. But he also makes an allusion to Moses. He connects Jesus to Moses. And we're going to look at that today too, so that we can see what Matthew is telling us about how Jesus connects to the Exodus. And that way we can read Matthew's gospel according to our objective in light of the larger biblical story, because that's how Matthew wants us to see that everything in the biblical story was all pointing to this Nazarene, this Jesus of Nazareth. So let's get started. Go ahead and turn to Hosea 11:1, or just Hosea 11. And we're going to do what we've been doing. Every time there's an Old Testament quotation, we have that chart in your book on page 20. In the left-hand column, we're going to put, oh, you know what? It should say in your book, I'm just now noticing this, at the top of page 20, that left column should say Hosea 11:1-7, just like it does on the screen. So you can just add that in, because we want to look at the whole context of Hosea 11:1. So we're going to look at Hosea 11:1-7. It is verse 1 that Matthew quotes, but he's inviting us to see that passage in its entire context and how it relates to Jesus. And then the right column should say Jesus and Hosea 11:1-7, just like it says on the screen. So you can just make that correction for me. That is a mistake that I missed until right now. What we're going to do is, in that left column, we're going to write 3 points about what Hosea 11:1-7 is talking about, its context. And then in the right column, we'll be able to write down, how does Jesus fulfill this? What is Matthew inviting us to consider here about how Jesus fulfills what Hosea is talking about? Now, I didn't have you read this. You can stay there in Hosea 11. But let me just read to you how Matthew quotes from Hosea 11, and then we'll go and we'll look at Hosea 11. So in Matthew 2, again, you don't have to turn there. Here's where Matthew gives us the quotation. Now, when they had departed, that is Joseph and Mary, that's the Magi. Now, when the Magi had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And Joseph rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. Now here's the quote. "This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" There's the quotation from Hosea 11. What does that mean? How does Jesus fulfill Hosea 11? Let's look at it. Read with me Hosea 11, and let's read these first 7 verses. Hosea 11, starting in verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. And I bent down and fed them. They shall not return to Egypt, but Assyria shall be their king, because they have refused to return to me. The sword shall rage against their cities, consume the bars of their gates, and devour them because of their own counsels. My people are bent on turning away from me. And though they call out to the Most High, he shall not raise them up at all. Now, that is the context of Hosea 11:1. Matthew quotes from verse 1, but again, whenever a New Testament author quotes an Old Testament passage, at least most of the time, if not every time, that New Testament author is drawing our attention to the entire context of that passage, not just the few lines that are quoted. The few lines are the doorway into reflection. Let me reflect on this passage and what this New Testament author is saying. So Matthew is inviting us to reflect on this section of Hosea. So let's first put 2 points in our left column. What is Hosea 11, 1-7 talking about? So then we can see how Jesus connects to it. Well, here's the first one. Most obvious one. In Hosea 11, verse 1, we're told that God called his son Israel out of Egypt. That's the first point you can put in the left column there. God called his son Israel out of Egypt. And God makes that statement not because he is wanting to reflect on how great things are with him and his son. He makes that statement because of its contrast to how Israel is treating him. In other words, Robert, go ahead. Page 20 in the book, sorry. Yeah, page 20 in the book. God makes this statement to contrast his loving actions towards his son Israel with his son's mistreatment of him. Did you see that when we were reading Hosea 11? And so let me put something on the screen here. Let me put the second point, and then we'll go back to the text and look at it. So God called his son Israel out of Egypt, but the point in Hosea 11 is that, pardon me. All right, I got ahead of myself, and I was just thinking, how do I fix this? I can't. So let me leave you in suspense with that point. Like, what is he going to say? This is the Alfred Hitchcock way of teaching here. I'm going to leave you in suspense. Hold that thought. Let me back up and show you something from Exodus, because this is important. In the Old Testament narrative, we need to understand how Israel is depicted. They are depicted as God's son. Now, we see that in Hosea 11, verse 1, out of Egypt I called my son, but I want to show you this from Exodus chapter 4. God says to Moses, "Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son." Now, the reason I want to bring this to your attention is because of what we're going to discuss in a few minutes about how Jesus fulfills this passage in Hosea 11:1. But to understand Matthew's point, we need to understand that in the Old Testament, if someone was to ask, who was God's son in the Old Testament? Well, one answer to that is the Davidic kings, the line of David. That was God's son. Psalm 2, which we looked at in our very first class. Psalm 2 is an example. God said to David, I'm going to put your descendant on the throne, and he shall be a son to me, and I will be a father to him. So one Old Testament answer is God's son is the Davidic king. But another Old Testament answer, who is God's son? It's Israel. It's the nation of Israel. They were the son of God whom he called out of Egypt to fulfill his purposes. Now, that brings us back to Hosea 11. This is the point that I was going to make, that I left you in suspense about. So God called his son Israel out of Egypt, but here's the point of Hosea 11. Israel was a disobedient son. Israel was a disobedient son. That's why in Hosea 11, God contrasts his loving actions with Israel's rebellion. Look back at Hosea 11. Look at what God says in verse 2. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. You see the pain of God in this passage? The pain of a father who's given everything to his son, and the son's reaction is to just reject the father. And then look at what God says in verse 7, the first line of verse 7 of Hosea 11. My people are bent on turning away from me. It's like it's just in their nature to rebel. And so in Hosea 11, we're given this passage where God is speaking about his son, whom he called out of Egypt, but that son was disobedient to the father. Now, before we start looking at how Jesus fulfills this passage, I want you to notice two things that are very interesting about this passage. When you think of fulfillment, when you hear somebody say, Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecies, just see if you're like me. This is how I used to think of that. I used to think, okay, an Old Testament prophet made a prediction about something in the future, and then Jesus did that prediction. He fulfilled it. Is that basically that's what we think of as fulfillment? Yeah. And that's not wrong. It's just one-dimensional. Because what I want you to see in this passage is how sophisticated and three-dimensional Matthew's conception of fulfillment is. Because look at Hosea 11:1. Is it a passage looking to the future? Is it predicting anything? How so? How is it predicting something? Say again. How is it predicting the crucifixion? In other words, when Hosea says that to Israel, are they hearing Hosea and thinking to themselves, oh, something's coming in the future? I'm not saying you're wrong, Andrew, but I'm saying in the passage, there's nothing inherently future-looking on the surface. Yeah. So the point that I want you to see is, in Hosea 11:1, there's no prediction being made. It's God looking backwards at the Exodus. Out of Egypt I called my son. Well, that's in the past. That's not a future prediction like what we saw last week in Micah 5:2. In Micah 5:2, God predicts a ruler will be born in Bethlehem. That's a future prediction. And Jesus does fulfill that. So there's that prediction fulfillment. Although I hope after last week you see there's a lot more to Micah 5:2 than just that. But at least there's an example of prediction fulfillment. But in Hosea 11:1, there is no prediction. How can Jesus fulfill a passage that looks backwards in history? It doesn't even look forwards. Well, that shows us, hey, Matthew's got a lot more three-dimensional concept of fulfillment here than we typically espouse. And here's the other thing I want you to notice. In Hosea 11:1, who is God's son? A nation. Hosea 11:1 isn't even talking about a person. It's talking about a nation. how can Jesus, as an individual, fulfill a passage that is talking about a historical event that Israel as a nation went through? How does that work? Well, that's what I want us to make sure that we grasp today, so that we can understand Matthew's concept of fulfillment, because this is going to be a key element to how Matthew presents Jesus to us, especially in Matthew 4, when we get to the testing in the wilderness. So let me explain these two issues. Let's first address the one we talked about last week. And it's the issue of how can Jesus fulfill a passage that's talking about the nation of Israel when he's just an individual person? Well, that brings us to what we discussed last week. Remember this? This idea of corporate solidarity. It's just a fancy term. All it refers to is the idea that you have a group of people who have a representative, and that representative assumes the identity of the group. He takes on their characteristics, and we talked last week about how Matthew presents Jesus as the representative of Israel who lives their history in his individual experience. And so that's why in Matthew 2, you have the Exodus. In Matthew 3, you have Jesus then pass through the water, baptism. And then in Matthew 4, you have the testing in the wilderness. See what Matthew's doing? He has purposefully structured his narrative to get us to see, hey, Jesus is living Israel's experience. And that's because Matthew is showing us, yes, because he is the representative of Israel. He's the champion of Israel. Just like when David goes out to fight Goliath, David does not just represent himself. He represents Israel and Israel's God. And Goliath represents the Philistines and the Philistines' gods. So that when David wins that fight, it's not just a victory for David. It's a victory for Israel and Israel's God. Because David is the representative of all that. Matthew is showing us Jesus is the representative for Israel. And so, because of that, Jesus doesn't just take on the group's identity, but also in this idea of corporate solidarity, Jesus' fate as the representative will be shared with the group. And so, for example, just think ahead to Matthew 4. Israel failed in the wilderness. They failed the temptation. Satan beat Israel in the wilderness. They died. They gave in to temptation. But when Jesus, the champion and representative of Israel, faces Satan toe-to-toe in the wilderness in Matthew 4, who wins? Jesus. And because he's the representative of Israel, Israel wins. Israel will now share in that victory. And so anyone who is connected to Jesus shares in his victory over Satan. And that's why we talked about last week when Jesus is crucified. One of the angles to look at that is he's going through the exile. He's living the punishment in his personal experience. He's living the punishment of exile, which the Old Testament prophets spoke of as a death of the nation. He lives that in himself, but the difference is he doesn't do it because of his sins. He does it because he's taking on the sins of the group, Israel, so that he can bear that. But then he's raised in victory, which means Israel is victorious, which means the world is victorious, since Israel was the one God said, they will be the ones through whom my blessing goes to all nations. So this is one answer to that question. How can Jesus fulfill a passage that's talking about the nation of Israel? He fulfills it because he is Israel. He is the representative of Israel. What questions or thoughts do you have on this idea of corporate solidarity before we look at the next idea, which will help us understand how can Jesus fulfill a passage that looks backwards? But first, I wanted to address how can Jesus fulfill a passage that's talking about a group of people? Well, this is how. He's the representative of Israel. He will fulfill everything Israel was meant to do. What questions or thoughts do you have on this? Yeah, Ken? Yeah.
And basically say this is how you should.
Yeah.
And of course, they failed because they refused.
Yes.
But then along comes Christ.
Yes.
To introduce, I guess, the final solution, if you will.
Yeah. Yes. And what Ken just said is there a parallel then in Israel was supposed to be the one to be a light to the nations, just to summarize everything Ken said there. They were supposed to be the ones to show the world, here's what God's like and here's how you serve him. They failed. So then what happened about God's promise that they'd be a light to the nations? Well, think about how Jesus is introduced in his gospel. Do you remember the first line of Matthew's gospel? The beginning of the gospel, or the beginning of, or sorry, I'm getting it mixed up with Mark. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. He will fulfill. He is that light to the nations. And because he's the representative of Israel, it's still Israel who's a representative of the nations. It's Israel embodied in himself as the champion. I'm going to say more about that later today, so I'm going to flesh that out. But Ken is exactly right there. He's thinking along this track. This is how Matthew wants us to see Jesus. And this is what we miss when we just kind of read his quote of Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I called my son. Oh, okay, and then just keep reading. Whoa, dig in. Look at all these riches that Matthew is giving to us to see who this man is and what he's accomplishing for humanity. Yes, sir, Mr. Jim? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's just more revelation. You know, so Mr. Jim just asked, how does Matthew make this connection? Do you remember in Luke's gospel, the two disciples on the road to Emmaus? And do you remember what Luke says there? It says that after Jesus reveals himself to them, he then shows them everything in the, I forget the phrase, either he says everything in the scriptures or everything in Moses and the prophets about himself. Well, what Jesus did with the disciples on the road to Emmaus, Matthew, as the beneficiary of that, who was also hearing that teaching from Jesus, he's now sharing that with us. So in other words, if you've ever wondered, what did Jesus say to those disciples on the road to Emmaus? Matthew is one window into that. Like, these are the types of things Jesus would have taught them. Here's how the Old Testament points to me. Everything in it. The Exodus, David, the temple, the tabernacle, everything. It all points to me. And so that's what we're getting in Matthew's gospel. Well, let's talk about then, okay, I see how Jesus can fulfill a passage that's talking about a nation, but how can Jesus fulfill a passage that's looking backwards? It's not even making a prediction about anything. Well, for this, we need to understand a concept. It's another fancy word. Maybe you've heard it before. It's called typology. Now, I'm going to put a definition on the screen. It's also at the bottom of page 20. The definition may be a head scratcher for you. I like the definition, but I admit it's a little, the first time you read it, especially if you're not familiar with this concept, you might be like, what in the world does that mean? Don't worry. I'm going to explain it and put some visuals on the screen to help, to make it make sense for it. But here's what typology means. It's just a recognition of God's orchestration of historical correspondences between people, events, and institutions which escalate in significance across the Bible's redemptive historical story, and which are highlighted in various ways by biblical authors. Now, some of you just took a short nap, probably when I was reading that definition. Here's all that means. Typology just means it's a recognition of the fact that when you look and you see what God did in the Old Covenant era, there are patterns there that show us what he was going to do in the New Covenant era, in Jesus Christ. God is a designer, and he orchestrated things in the past to teach us the New Covenant realities that we would experience. Let me give you an example. I want to put some on the screen. Here's all typology means. In the Old Covenant, or what we call the Old Testament, you've got people, events, and institutions that God set up, that he orchestrated, people that he raised up. And when you get to the New Testament, again, going back to what Mr. Jim was saying, where Jesus is saying, I'm going to show you how everything in the scriptures points to me. It's that recognition that everything God had done was foreshadowing and would correspond to the things that he would do in the new covenant era. There's patterns to recognize here. That's all typology is. It's just recognizing those patterns. So take these three examples. The first one, think of the old covenant position of high priest. Why did God do that? Why did God decide, I'm going to make this role of a high priest and I'm going to have this be a person in Israel? Why did God do that? Because he was teaching us, here's what I'm going to do with Jesus as the mediator between you and me. Sinful humanity and a holy God, like what Keegan talked about today. Well, we need a mediator for that. Yes, you do. I'm going to create a high priest position to teach you these concepts so that then when I give you Jesus, you're going to better understand his role as a mediator between sinful humanity and myself. That's typology. God was orchestrating a pattern that would then be fulfilled or repeated in Jesus. Or take the Exodus, for example. Why is that part of the biblical story? Why did God have his people enslaved in Egypt and then lead them out? Just why do it that way? He didn't have to. He's the God of everything. He could have skipped over that or something. Why did he do that? Because it was going to teach us about what God was going to free humanity from in his new covenant deliverer, Jesus. In fact, when you look at Luke's gospel, there's a passage in Luke, sorry, let me get it on my slide here. There's a passage in, again, holding you in suspense. Here we go. Got ahead of myself. All right. In Luke 9:30-31, there's that very thought-provoking passage where Luke tells us that Jesus was speaking to Moses and Elijah in the Transfiguration about the exodus he would perform in Jerusalem. And then there's also Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14-15, the Hebrews author says that Jesus delivered us from slavery to death. And so the Exodus was, yes, it was an event in history, but it was an event God orchestrated because it was going to point towards the ultimate deliverance that he would bring to humanity through his new Moses, Jesus, and the deliverance from slavery to Satan, sin, and death. That's typology. There's patterns. God has done all this on purpose. Nothing is chance here. Yeah, Andrew? Yeah. Exactly. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Exactly. And this is just a manifestation of that attribute of him. And then finally, think of the temple. Think of the institution of the temple in the Old Covenant era. It's the dwelling place of God. But then when you get to the New Testament, and the New Testament authors are saying the church is the temple of God. Like in 1 Peter 2, verse 5. Notice what Peter's doing there. He's saying, look, if you want to understand what it means to be a community where God dwells, look back at the temple. Because that was established to teach you something about being the dwelling place of God, protecting its holiness and its sanctity and all those things. So that's what typology means. It's just recognizing these patterns. In fact, I'll give you another example. So Andrew, just a week or two ago, Andrew, even if he wasn't thinking of this as typology, he brought this up in class. We were talking about how Matthew presents Jesus as a new and greater David. And Andrew made the point, when you look back at David's life, he suffered before he fully reigned. That's typology. Because God orchestrated the broad events of David's life to point towards that suffering son of David, that Jesus would reign, yes, but he was going to suffer first. And he was pointing to that in David's life itself, the broad contours of it. That's typology. So, what that means then for us. this is how Matthew can claim that Jesus fulfills Hosea 11:1. Yes, that passage looks backwards, but the reason Jesus fulfills it is because in the Exodus, there was a pattern there of God's delivering work that was going to be repeated in Jesus. So if you want to understand what's Jesus' mission, you remember in Matthew 1, verse 21, the angel says he will deliver his people from their sins. What's Matthew's presentation of Jesus' mission? Well, it includes going back to the Exodus. If you want to understand how Jesus frees humanity, think of what the Exodus is, because that was meant to point to the delivering work of Jesus Christ himself. God orchestrated it that way on purpose. So let's put 2 points in the right column here. Let's start now talking about, okay, let's crystallize this and think, how does Jesus fulfill Hosea 11:1-7? Well, the first one maybe is the easiest. God called his son Israel out of Egypt, and what Matthew is telling us is God called his son Jesus out of Egypt. This is the easiest one. In other words, Jesus fulfills the concept of what it means to be God's son. Israel was supposed to fulfill that. They didn't. But their champion will. Their representative will. He will fulfill that. What that means for us as Gentiles, I'll talk about here in a few minutes. But let's put the second one on. When we talk about typology, one thing I didn't mention on purpose, yes, you're going to see these historical correspondences. You know, oh yeah, I can see the correspondence between the Exodus and what Jesus is doing, or David as the shepherd king and Jesus as the shepherd king. I can see the patterns. But one other element of typology is noticing the dissimilarities. Where are they different? And that's what Matthew will focus on in Matthew 4, like I already mentioned. So Israel was a disobedient son, but as you keep reading Matthew, what we see is this dissimilarity, Jesus will be an obedient son. The dissimilarities are also important in typology. You want to notice that discontinuity as well. And so, Andrew, I'll get you in 1 second. And so, whereas, yes, Jesus is living in his personal experience, he's living what the nation of Israel went through, but the one key difference is he does not sin. He does not fail, which again is what Matthew 4 is all about. He will beat Satan in the wilderness. Yeah, Andrew? Yes, and because he's their representative, his victory becomes theirs. It's very good. Well, let's put our third point in each column. I told you there were 3. So there's one more. So, and this is really just an extension of that second point. So in that left column, what we're seeing in Hosea 11 is that Israel failed to fulfill God's purposes. Israel failed to fulfill God's purposes. Don't forget a key part of the Exodus story. When God when he commands Pharaoh to let his people go, it's so that his son might come and serve him. Let Israel go that they may serve me. In other words, God had creation purposes that he had chosen Israel to be his instrument for. It's not just so Israel can go and enjoy a nice long holiday in the land of Canaan, and we're just going to relax. It's so that they could work on the Father's behalf. Well, Jesus, if he's the one who's going to be obedient to God as an obedient son, well then he, as Israel's representative, he will fulfill God's purposes. And again, what does that mean for us as Gentiles? I'll talk about that in just a moment. Israel's victory means everything for you and me as Gentiles. Everything. I'll flesh that out here in a few minutes. But this is at least the point I want you to get from Hosea 11. So we can summarize it like this in that question underneath your chart. In that question, Let's summarize everything we've said here. What is Matthew telling us by claiming Jesus fulfills Hosea 11:1? How would we summarize just all this? I would summarize it this way. Matthew is telling us that Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel who will accomplish Israel's mission as an obedient son of God. Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel who will accomplish Israel's mission as an obedient son of God. That's what Matthew is telling us when he says very succinctly, when Jesus comes out of Egypt, this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew is just inviting us, hey, reflect on that. Think about everything that means in the context of Hosea 11. And that's what we've done here today. This is what Matthew is telling us. Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel, who will accomplish Israel's purposes as an obedient son of God. What questions or thoughts do you have on this quotation that Matthew makes of Hosea 11:1? Yes, ma'am. Sister Tanza? Ooh, I love that. So Tanza had the audacity to try to correct my wording here. That's basically what she's doing here. She said, well, I would have worded it this way. That's what you do. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just playing. I know that's not the spirit, which I just had to pick on her a little bit. But no, she said, I love how she said it. And if this strikes you, put it down in your book. Say it again for us, Tanza. I'll repeat it so they can hear. Jesus did what Israel did not do. And Jesus did what I could not do. And that's another great way of saying it. Jesus did everything we couldn't do. He did everything Israel couldn't do. Because he is Israel's champion, and by extension, he's humanity's champion. He's the champion of humanity. Any other thoughts or questions on this quotation? Hosea 11:1. Let me just briefly speak about the second way that Matthew connects Jesus to the Exodus, and then we'll close with some applications. Now, for this, I'm going to go in a different order than it's in your book. I've shifted things around here so we could stay on the theme of the Exodus. So, would you, in your book, would you flip to page 23? And look at the top of page 23. There's no blanks there. I've already given you these, but I want to discuss these briefly. Another way that Matthew connects Jesus to the Exodus is by making an allusion that connects Jesus to Moses. Now, when I say an allusion, in case that's an unfamiliar term, an allusion is where you're referring to something indirectly or without necessarily quoting it. So, for example, if I said, beam me up, Scotty, what am I alluding to? Don't even. Star Wars. Julia did that on purpose to offend my nerd sensibilities here. Star Trek, but it's not a quote. Nowhere in the show does Kirk ever say, beam me up, Scotty. That's not a quote. But it's an allusion. It's a reference to Star Trek that you understand. We have a lot of these allusions in our hymns. Think of, O thou fount of every blessing. And I think it's verse 3 where it says, here I raise my Ebenezer, by thy help I've come. That's an allusion to 1 Samuel chapter 7, where Israel defeats the Philistines and Samuel raises up the stone and names it Ebenezer, for by your help we've come thus far. It's an allusion to that story in 1 Samuel 7. Well, Matthew does the same thing. He doesn't just quote the Old Testament, he alludes to it in his presentation of Jesus as the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so, here's how in Matthew 2, he makes some allusions to connect Moses to Jesus. The first one you can see in your book is one actually Julia mentioned a few weeks ago. When you just read Matthew 2 and you read of Herod killing the children, your mind probably went where Julia's did. She shared, this reminds me of the Pharaoh. When the Pharaoh is wanting to kill the Hebrew male children, out of fear that they're going to keep growing in their population. And think about it from another angle. If Israel is God's son, as Exodus presents Israel as, then what's Pharaoh trying to do by wiping out the line of Israel by killing the male children? He's trying to kill God's son, which also see that parallel with Herod. It's exactly what Herod was doing. I want to try to kill God's son. So one way that Matthew connects Jesus to Moses is by giving us Matthew 2 and structuring the story in a way where like, hey, I see some parallels here. I see some typology, some patterns here that are being repeated. But then Matthew does make it more explicit. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 20, I won't go there for time's sake, but you have it in your book. Matthew makes an allusion to Exodus 4:19, where God says to Moses, go back to Egypt, for the ones who sought your life are dead. And then in Matthew 2, verse 20, the angel says to Joseph, go back to the land of Israel, for the ones who sought the child's life are dead. And even in English, you can see that parallel there. But in Greek, it's even more similar. You know, Matthew is copying the Greek language from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. All Matthew does is change a few words to make it make sense that Jesus is talking about the child, whereas in Exodus, he's talking directly to Moses. So Matthew's making that allusion to purposefully connect Jesus to Moses there. Well, why is he doing that? What is Matthew inviting us then to reflect on by connecting Jesus to Moses? Well, it's this final point. Matthew is inviting us to reflect on the fact that Jesus is the new Moses who will lead the new Exodus of God's people. And Matthew will even do some other things that kind of connect Jesus to Moses. But this is what he's inviting us to reflect on. Jesus is the new Moses. I want to think of it this way. For Matthew, Jesus is like a prism. You ever held a prism up to a ray of light? And when you turn, you can turn that prism and the light hits it and it makes all these nice colors and designs. But if you turn the prism, the designs change. Equally beautiful, but there's a difference there. That's what Jesus is like when you hold him up to the light of the Old Testament. From one angle, from the Old Testament to Jesus, you can see the pattern of, oh, Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel, who accomplishes Israel's purposes. You turn it another way, and oh, Jesus is the new Moses, who is going to lead the deliverance for God's people. Turn Jesus another way. Oh, he's the new David. He's the new shepherd king. He's the new temple. He's the new Solomon. He's all of that. All of it was pointing to him. And that's how Matthew presents Jesus all throughout his narrative. All right. Well, let's wrap up with some applications here. Again, I'm going out of order. So for these applications, go back to page 21 of your book. And we're going to do the first application at the top of the page. And then I've got two more that are not in your book. Let's talk about that first application. This is where I want to flesh out just for a minute what Ken said earlier. One of the applications that we can take from all this richness that Matthew is presenting to us is this. Jesus' fulfillment of Israel means we have access to God. Jesus' fulfillment of Israel means we have access to God. That's that first application on page 21. It is very easy for us to miss this point or to not grasp its significance if we're not familiar with Israel's role in the Old Testament. We're going to miss this. So let me just flesh this out just for a minute. In the Old Testament, in Genesis 1, man and woman are given God's blessing. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. Well, then Genesis 3 happens. The man and the woman rebel. They sin. And that blessing is then marred. Now there's going to be pain in childbirth. Now the ground is going to be cursed and not produce like it. Now you're going to live in a fallen world, and man and woman are exiled from God's presence from the Garden of Eden. Well, what's God going to do about that? Well, he's going to call Abraham. Now Yahweh said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Think about what God is saying here. He's saying sin has messed everything up. But through you, Abraham, through your seed, my blessing will flow to all nations of the earth. In other words, through you, I'm going to undo all the curses of Genesis 3. I'm going to undo all of them. So, God put all his eggs in one basket. He said, through Abraham's seed, all nations will receive his blessing. But then when you keep reading the Old Testament, what do you see Israel do? They become like the nations. Israel is not a light to the nations like they should have been. Instead, they accept or they adopt the nation's darkness. They become just like the pagan world around them. And so the result of that is exile. They're exiled from God's presence, from the promised land. And see the parallels here, see the patterns, see the typology. The story of Israel is the story of Adam and Eve. Created for God's purposes, they sinned, exiled from God's presence. Israel's story is the story of humanity in miniature. It's a microcosm of the story of humanity. Okay, but God put all his eggs in this basket. He said that through Israel, his blessing was going to come to all nations. Well, when the Old Testament ends, yes, some of Israel has come back to the promised land, but they're still ruled over by pagans. There is no Davidic king. They are not ruling on their own. The glory of God did not come to the temple. They're still scattered among the nations. God, what about all these promises that you made? How is Israel going to be the conduit for God's blessing to all nations when they themselves are still under the curse for sin? Well, that's Matthew's good news. Jesus fulfills Israel's purpose. And so what that means for us as Gentiles is God's blessing can now flow to us through the Son of Abraham, Jesus of Nazareth. Israel's victory is victory for us because it was through Israel that God said, I will have my blessing go to all nations. The only reason, and let me put it this way, the only reason we are sitting in this building seeking communion to God and enjoying the blessing of a relationship with God, the only reason for that is because Jesus fulfilled Israel's purpose. Because God put all his eggs in that basket. And so by Jesus fulfilling the purposes of Israel, we as Gentiles can now come like the Magi of Matthew 2 to worship the King of the Jews and to pay homage to him, and to, like the Canaanite woman, later in Matthew's gospel, we can come to the King and say, it's in you where our hope is. If you will, we just want to eat the crumbs from your table. Because we know this is where God's blessing is at, right here. So Israel's victory is our victory. And then finally, let me give you just two more here. This next application is not in your book. In fact, if you look at page 21, that second bullet at the top of the page, we're going to do that application next week. So I know I'm going out of order here, but you can write in these next two applications anywhere there on page 21. I want to mention this because I think this is important when it comes to, what can we take from this talk about typology and patterns? Let me put it on the screen and then I'll explain why I'm adding this. Here it is. God's personal involvement in history for our benefit should elicit our praise. God's personal involvement in history for our benefit should elicit our praise. Coincidentally, I was watching a TV show the other day, and this is kind of what sparked this. And it's a horror show, so there's a lot of bad things happening to people. In the show, a character, after all these bad things have happened, a character is crying and says to her friend, I used to think there was some grand design. But now I just see that there is no grand design and we're just going to die here. And the friend says to her, it's hard to see the sweater when you're only just a thread. Now, here's the kicker. We can hear that and think, oh yeah, that makes sense. Just because we can't see the design doesn't mean there isn't one. We can say amen to that. Here's the problem. In the show, there is no God. There's no God in the show's worldview. It's just humans versus evil. And so, like a lot of TV shows, if you watch things critically, if you are analyzing the messaging of these shows that our entertainment industry produces, what you will see time and time again is that they will deny, either implicitly in the worldview of the show or explicitly, they will deny a God. There is no creator, but they'll have people still say things like, but you still matter. There's still a design. And it's just like taking, think of water. Water is H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Imagine taking out the hydrogen atom. So now all you have is an oxygen atom, and someone saying to you, hey, but this is still water if you just believe hard enough. You can still quench your thirst with this. That's the ridiculousness of what our entertainment industry presents to us. You have purpose and there's a design, but there is no God. There's no design. It's contradictory. But what Matthew shows us is that we know better. Because when we start thinking about typology and those patterns, what you're seeing, brothers and sisters, is that no, there is a creator who has personally involved himself in history, in the lives of human beings. And he is moving his creation towards a glorious end in the return of the Messiah and the new creation, where all evil will be defeated and there will be restoration between human beings and God himself. All creation is moving to that. And so this is why I wanted to add this application. That should elicit our praise, because we can come here and we can know, yes, there is a design, but it's not because we just choose to believe it. It's because there is, as a fact, a creator who has involved himself in history and has done that most acutely in the man Jesus of Nazareth, who accomplishes all of God's new creation purposes and is making all things new, as Revelation points out. The only response to that that's appropriate is praise, because God has invited us into that so that we can be a part of it and enjoy the blessings of it. And then finally, one more. This won't take me but 1 minute. I want to give you this statement as an application and then a question to leave you with. If Jesus is our new Moses, then our identity is what you see on the screen. We've been liberated from slavery to Satan, sin, and death. That's who we are as a people when we come here to worship. When people go to worship, even in countries where they're being persecuted, they assemble as a free people. They might conflict with the earthly forces of darkness now, but their eternal status is of a free person who's been liberated from the ultimate enemy, Satan, sin, and death. That's who you are. That's who we are at Creekside, a liberated people. And so then here's the question that leaves us with. How will you use your freedom? How will you use your freedom? Is it, I'm free, time to be my own God, time to do what I want to do, which ironically leads you right back into slavery, to Satan, sin, and death? Or is it the response, I'm free, now I will serve Jesus Christ? And there is where true freedom can be found. And so as you read Matthew's gospel, think about all the things you see Jesus freeing people from: sickness, death, sin, demonic oppression. He is the great liberator. He is the new Moses. And so for today, I hope now you can see from Matthew 2 one more angle from which you can read Jesus in light of the Old Testament, and you can read the Old Testament in light of Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel. who accomplishes Israel's purposes as an obedient Son of God. And He is the new Moses who has led us to freedom from Satan's sin and death. And so this week, brothers and sisters, live that freedom by serving Jesus Christ. And God be with you this week. I'll see you next Sunday, Lord willing.